Picture this. It's the late 1940s. The world is barely recovering from the most destructive war in human history, and already two superpowers are squaring up for round two. Except this time, the battlefield isn't Europe. It's the most hostile, desolate, and unforgiving place on the entire planet, Antarctica. In 1948, a group of Western nations sat down and carved up territorial claims to the frozen continent like it was a pizza. Scientific outposts, sovereignty flags, the whole deal. And the Soviet Union? Not invited, not consulted, not even given a courtesy heads up. If you know anything about the Soviet mindset during the Cold War, you already know how well that went down. The Kremlin's response was immediate and characteristically bold. If they couldn't be part of the club, they'd build a better one. By 1955, the USSR had formed its own official Antarctic expedition program and was loading ships headed straight for the ice. The mission was simple on paper. Get there, set up stations, plant the flag, and make sure the world knew the Soviet Union wasn't going to be left out of anything, not even at the bottom of the Earth. But here's what nobody had really thought through. Getting to Antarctica is one challenge. Moving around it is a completely different nightmare, and the solution they eventually landed on was something nobody would have predicted. A vehicle that looked like someone had taken a Soviet battle tank, ripped off the turret, stretched it to the length of a city bus, and built a small apartment block on top. It ran on tank tracks, was powered by a tank-derived engine, and could haul nearly 77 tons of cargo across terrain that had defeated every other vehicle sent to this continent. But before that machine could exist, the Soviets were about to find out the hard way just how brutal Antarctica really was. The first Soviet team touched down in 1955, set up a couple of coastal research stations, and immediately hit a problem that no amount of Cold War bravado could fix: the terrain. They'd brought military trucks, the same rugged workhorses that had hauled artillery across the Eastern Front. Tough machines, proven machines, completely and utterly useless on Antarctic snow. The wheels spun, the trucks sank, and the operation ground to an embarrassing halt. In desperation, someone suggested trying the farm tractors they'd packed almost as an afterthought. Slow, freezing cold to operate, zero creature comforts, but those wide metal treads actually gripped the ice. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. By 1957, the explorers had seen enough and sent word back to Moscow with a message that was equal parts scientific report and desperate plea. We are not equipped for this. Compasses barely worked thanks to the magnetic South Pole. Radios crackled and cut out constantly. The landscape was so featureless that drivers navigated by the sun and stars, which meant during blizzards, they were essentially guessing. And all of this while slowly freezing at temperatures most humans will never experience. Moscow listened. The second expedition arrived with the ATS, a tracked military tractor built on the legendary T-54 tank platform. Strip out the turret, rework the drivetrain, and you had something genuinely capable on ice. These machines could haul massive trailer loads, which mattered enormously, because in Antarctica, fuel isn't just fuel, it's survival. Between 70 and 75% of everything transported was diesel, used to power the vehicles and to keep people from freezing solid inside their cabins. The ATS opened up new territory, and 2 more research stations were established. But the deeper inland they pushed, the uglier the picture got. And what was happening to the crews in the extreme interior was about to expose just how far they still had to go. Diesel fuel freezes solid, not just thickens. Actually, chop it with an axe freezes. And when your entire survival strategy depends on diesel engines running continuously, that's not a minor inconvenience. That's a crisis. Crews found themselves lighting fires underneath the vehicles just to thaw the fuel enough to get the engines turning over. You're already at the bottom of the world, surrounded by white emptiness and wind that cuts through anything. And your morning routine involves crawling under a frozen tractor to light a campfire. Then came the altitude problem. The Antarctic interior sits on a vast elevated plateau, and as the tractors climbed past 10,000 feet, thinner air started starving the engines of oxygen. Power dropped off. Breakdowns became routine. Turbochargers helped somewhat, but only partially. The uncomfortable truth was sitting in every mission report. What they had simply wasn't good enough. What they needed was something never built before. A vehicle that was part tractor, part house, part laboratory, part life support system. Something a crew could live inside for weeks without ever opening a door. The question was, who could possibly build it? And the answer came not from looking at other vehicles, but from looking straight up at the sky. The Soviet engineers did something smart. Instead of asking what vehicle works best on ice, they asked what already keeps humans alive in extreme cold. And the answer was right above their heads: aircrafts. Planes routinely cruise where outside temperatures drop to -50, -60 degrees. The cabin stays warm and livable. The principles behind keeping a human being comfortable inside an aluminum tube at 35,000 feet were, in many ways, exactly what was needed for an Antarctic crawler. With that insight in hand, the Soviets went looking for a facility that understood both worlds: tracked vehicle manufacturing and aircraft construction. They found it in Kharkov, Ukraine, at the Kharkov Transport Engineering Plant. The brief they handed over was almost unreasonable: design and build the ultimate Antarctic exploration vehicle, with enclosed living quarters, a workshop, a scientific laboratory, and full crew accommodation. Deliver it in 3 months. 3 months. What came off that production line was genuinely impressive. The Harkovchanka looked like someone had taken a Soviet tank, stretched it, removed the turret, and bolted a self-contained habitat on top. 4 inches of synthetic wool packed between the cabin walls meant the interior would only lose 1 to 2 degrees per day without active heating. They were building a thermos flask, large enough for 8 people to live, eat, sleep, and work inside. The engine, a turbocharged diesel producing over 900 horsepower, sat inside the vehicle, reachable for maintenance without anyone stepping outside. The tracks were wider and longer than anything on the ATS tractors. Top speed was a modest 6.8 miles per hour, but connected to sleds carrying close to 77 tons of cargo. Slow and powerful was exactly what Antarctica demanded. Inside, the crew had a kitchen with an electric stove, sleeping bunks for 6 to 8 people, a mechanical workshop, and a fully equipped scientific laboratory. There was even a small observation dome in the ceiling, so the navigator could take star sightings without touching a door handle. 3 were built and shipped south in 1959, and the ice, as it always does, had a few opinions of its own. The mission was bold even by Soviet standards: drive to the geographical South Pole through completely uncharted interior terrain, not mapped, not surveyed from the air. Just go south, don't stop, and don't die. 16 men, 2 Harkovchanka vehicles, 1 ATS tractor as backup, and behind them, sleds loaded with enough diesel to make the convoy look more like a mobile fuel depot than a scientific expedition. The problem started immediately. Fuel consumption was savage, roughly 12 liters per kilometer at a crawling pace. The math was brutal from day one. Then the tracks started failing. Those wider, longer tracks that were supposed to be such an improvement lasted under 1,000 kilometers before requiring full replacement, a job that took 5 days. 5 days with the engine off. 5 days with no heat in a cabin that couldn't hold its temperature without it. The insulation that had looked so impressive on paper showed its limits fast. And in a cruel twist, the engine also ran too hot. Placed inside the cabin, it couldn't shed heat properly. The coolant couldn't do its job, and the crew couldn't get the temperature balance right in either direction. Too cold in the cabin. The engine is simultaneously overheating, the worst of both worlds. And yet, 20 days after setting out, the Soviet convoy pulled into the American station at the geographical South Pole. Cold, exhausted, running on the last of their reserves. But they made it. The Harkovchanka, flaws and all, had done something no land vehicle had done before. The question now was whether they could build a version that actually worked properly. For roughly 20 years, the first-generation vehicles kept grinding across Antarctic ice, flaws and all. But by the mid-1970s, Soviet engineers had enough hard-won experience to know exactly what needed to change. The most counterintuitive decision, moving the engine back outside. The entire selling point of the original design was keeping everything internal. The second generation went back to an external engine layout, with far better integration between the power system and the cabin. Insulation was rethought from scratch. The structural bolts holding the first generation's cabin walls together had tiny gaps between them, barely detectable in a factory, but catastrophic at -60 in the field. Cold air found every single one. The second generation sealed everything properly. The smartest addition was the auxiliary engine, a separate, smaller power unit that ran the heating and electrical systems independently of the main motor. The crew could shut down the primary engine overnight and still wake up in a warm cabin. A simple solution to a problem that had made life miserable for 2 decades. 3 second-generation vehicles were completed by late 1975 and shipped south. Feedback came back immediately: warmer, quieter, more reliable, genuinely more comfortable. Over the next 20 years, they supported scientific missions, international collaborations, and pushed Antarctic exploration further than the first generation ever had. Everything pointed toward a third generation. The engineers had earned the right to build it. They never got the chance. By the late 1980s, plans for a third-generation Harkovchanka existed. Engineers had the experience and the data to build something genuinely extraordinary, but it was never built. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and with it went the funding, the political structures, and the appetite for building expensive specialized machines for a continent at the opposite end of the world. The new Russian Federation had far more immediate problems. It was, in a strange way, almost identical in fate to the American snow cruiser the Soviets had studied so carefully decades earlier. That machine had been killed not by the ice, but by World War II, swallowing up the money that might have kept it alive. The Harkovchanka met the same ending, not defeated by Antarctica, but by history. 6 vehicles continued serving Russian Antarctic operations for years after the collapse, kept running through legacy maintenance and the stubborn practical knowledge Antarctic crews accumulate over careers. But time and the ice are patient, and eventually they catch up with everything. Several were simply abandoned at remote stations when the cost of keeping them operational became impossible to justify. Left where they stopped, the ice slowly built up around the tracks, worked into the seams, and began reclaiming machines that had once defied it. Explorers who have come across them describe a genuinely eerie experience. These enormous crawlers, which once carried Soviet scientists to the South Pole, sitting silent and motionless in the same cold they were engineered to conquer. The Harkovchanka was imperfect, noisy, fuel-hungry, occasionally a very expensive way to be almost warm enough. But when it mattered, when the mission was to reach the South Pole through territory no vehicle had crossed before, it delivered. And in the brutal arithmetic of Antarctic survival, that is the only measure that counts.